Yeah.
So I gained a lot of notoriety because of this book. So ordinarily I do work in violence prevention related to genocide, civil wars, gender-based violence, and increasing rates of suicide around the world, and related to global health. So I had never really been focused on domestic partisan politics. In fact, I didn't pay much attention to it, but the morning after election, 2016 election, my phone was ringing off the hook and my email account was being flooded by basically by the people I worked with on prison reform in this country, and they were civil society organizations, activist groups, lawyers, students, documentary filmmakers. They were all trying to get in touch with me, and their concern was the violence that was to come. And what would I have to say as a violence expert? Well, what could they do? So I came to think about this for the first time, that if I devoted my career to studying, predicting, and preventing violence, would I turn away in the face of perhaps the greatest violence we could ever confront? And so that is how I started to think about the issue, and shortly after the election, a close colleague of mine, or an older colleague of mine, Dr. Judith Herman, whom many of you know, together with two very brave women, Drs. Nanette Gartrell and Dee Mosbacher, wrote a letter to President Barack Obama asking for a neuropsychiatric evaluation of the president-elect. And I agreed with that and thought I might do something similar of my own. So I asked around. I wrote letters of my own and asked around among my colleagues, and it turned out that it seemed like there was pretty much a consensus medically that this president-elect and soon president was dangerous, but no one would sign on to any letters that I wrote. And I thought that was not good. The reasons they gave were fears about spending the rest of their careers fighting for their licenses for having spoken up, because this being a vindictively litigious president, and also fear for their own and their family's safety because of his violence-prone followers. And so I thought that there was a need to break the ice somehow, that if we came out all together and spoke about this issue, then that would be easier. And I felt that we needed to speak about the issue, but I was also concerned about the ethics of it. How could we speak out responsibly and ethically, and was I missing something? That of course there was a lot of talk at the time of what we informally call the Goldwater rule, now the infamous rule, which discourages psychiatrists from diagnosing individuals they have not personally examined, public figures they have not personally examined and gotten consent to do so. From my point of view, that rule actually is simply a repetition of good standards of practice. You don't diagnose someone without having all the information, including from a personal interview, and once you have a diagnosis, you don't publicly state it. You adhere to confidentiality. But what was alarming was the fact that the American Psychiatric Association modified its interpretation of the rule in a sense, in a direction that didn't make sense. It went in the opposite direction of science and evolving practice. In other words, they were saying that it's not just diagnosis, or what it's stated as professional opinion, but professional opinion is different from the opinion of a professional. So they were actually stating it more as an opinion of a professional. In other words, no comment of any objectively observable behavior, speech, or affect was permissible, even in an emergency. And that was very alarming to me, especially the timing of it, because it was done shortly after Donald Trump's inauguration. So at the time, I had recruited all the schools of health, including School of Medicine, School of Nursing, and School of Public Health, to hold a conference together. I didn't, of course, tell them what it was. It was about concerns about the new administration. But when I did eventually reveal the title, which was, does professional responsibility include a duty to warn in the case of danger due to mental instability in a public figure? Then the School of Nursing and School of Public Health dropped away, and the School of Medicine hung on, but I didn't wish to harm my alma mater and my institution in any way, so I just made it a personal conference. So in the end, only about 24 people showed up in this large auditorium primary space at Yale School of Medicine, with speakers such as Robert J. Lifton, Judith Herman, James Gilligan, and a member on the APA's ethics committee, Charles D.K., who's in my division. At the end of the conference, however, our conclusion was that we did have an overriding duty to warn, due to our societal responsibility, due to an analogy of the Tarasov provision. If the Goldwater rule were a public figure equivalent of confidentiality, of course there's no patient here, but if one could make that analogy, certainly we should make an analogy of a positive duty to warn if that public figure were to pose a danger. And that was our reasoning, and that was actually the reason for our feeling brave enough to come out with this book. The conference actually gained national and international attention despite the low turnout and smallness of the meeting. And after that, I was contacted by hundreds and hundreds of mental health professionals, later in the thousands. We later formed a coalition, first a national coalition, now a world coalition, because of these concerns. But also, out of it came this book. Macmillan contacted me to do a book on the proceedings of the conference, and so I collected 27 of the best essays, including many of the top mental health professionals in the country. But I tried to give it variety and different viewpoints, ranging from the signs and symptoms that we could observe in the president, backed up by much public data, and then a discussion on ethics, on the Goldwater rule, and a section on society, the societal reasons for our having come to this state of having an impaired president, and also some of the effects of potential dangers of having an impaired president. So at this time, we felt that it was important for mental health professionals to speak up, because right around this time the public was saying that soon the president should pivot to normalcy and and settle down in his presidency. And so the basic assertion of this book was that these traits were not so superficial, in fact that he would become more dangerous once he was in a position of power, once his power were more established, and that ultimately he would become uncontainable. Meanwhile, Congress members, after having heard of the conference, got in touch with me. So about a dozen got in touch with me, and I was consulting with them privately over the phone. One of them, a former majority and minority leader, a very influential person, was trying to arrange for me to testify before all of Congress in as soon as they were back in session in September of 2017. But for various political and other reasons, that never happened. And so a former assistant U.S. attorney, after waiting for this to happen and not happening, arranged for me to meet with about a dozen of her own contacts, mostly Democratic Congress members, but there was one Republican Congress member I just happened to speak with. And this was arranged very rapidly in the month of November, partly when he was showing signs of further deterioration following the first special counsel's indictments. And also during that time, I was contacted by two White House officials who were concerned about the president's condition. And they called me up because they had heard about this book. And so two of them probably talking to each other a few hours apart. And I referred them both to the emergency room because I was concerned about the fact that I seemed to be the only voice out there speaking about this, and so I wanted to maybe recruit someone else, and especially having spoken with White House contacts of his would be in a better position to do so. And so I was, and also I wanted to preserve that ability to educate the public and didn't want to be bound by confidentiality rules. So that was my reason for passing the people on without getting much information. And but then I tried to follow up with the emergency room, couldn't get much information, nothing much came of it. So in early December, I invited Dr. James Gilligan, an expert on violence and a former mentor of mine, actually
former
still.
mass mental graduate.
Yes, and he was my.
And we know him well.
Member of the program. Member of the program.
Yes, you're all acquaintances and fellow colleagues. And this is actually where I met him, at Mass General. So, so we went together to Capitol Hill and met with the Congress members. And the reception was incredible. One of the senators actually said he had never so waited for a meeting in 11 years, that they were so eager to meet with us, that they too were incredibly concerned primarily of the president's access to the nuclear weapons. They personally knew that there were simply no barriers and how easy that access was. And so, but they were, we were looking to them to figure out a solution, but what we learned was they felt powerless being in the minority party. And in fact, it was interesting how they were turning back to us for guidance. And so at that time, I went through the standard medical process in the case of danger in an individual, that usually we remove access to weapons and we do an urgent evaluation whether they consent to it or not. And that comment got publicized a lot. But that was the usual right to treatment process that the president is not necessarily an exception to. So afterwards, I found that they were right in their assessment, in fact, that the Republican Congress members, even those who were worried about World War III because of the president's mental state, soon rallied behind him when there was tax legislation to be passed, and so nothing was being done. And so when January came along and there were the comments back and forth about whose nuclear button is bigger, between the president and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, that I decided to talk with the press about my conversations with Congress members, and that actually just created a firestorm in the news, and I was interviewing 14 hours a day, every single day, not having time to go to the bathroom and having my first meal of the day in the middle of the night. But I thought it was important because the topic of mental health was in the news every single day. And however, just as after the release of the book, 3 days after the release, the American Psychiatric Association came out with a public statement stating that there is no duty to warn outside of a pre-established patient-provider relationship, and they came out 6 days after I started talking to the press that armchair psychiatry and politicizing psychiatry were not allowed. And they made it clear in their statement they were talking about me. They said that even if you do not belong as a member to the APA, you are to heed their warnings. Because I had resigned actually 10 years earlier because I opposed their taking so much funding from pharmaceutical companies. And they stated this even though I was trying to avoid armchair psychiatry. I wasn't diagnosing. In fact, I was calling for an urgent evaluation so that we could avoid armchair psychiatry. And and they have in their ethical guidelines that we are to serve, that we are to be of public service by consulting with the 3 branches of government, and that is exactly what I was doing. I wasn't seeking them out. I was heeding an attorney's request for a consultation, and in fact I didn't follow up further because I wanted to make sure that I was open to consultation by Republican Congress members as well. So their statement was very misleading, I felt, and also while I was trying to keep the discussion nuanced by refusing primetime cable channel news discussions where you only have 3 to 5 minutes. There was a past president of the APA who took these opportunities to speak about the book and speak about me in a very misrepresentative way. In fact, he asserted that the book said the opposite of what it was saying. It was obvious he didn't read the book. And then called us Nazi or Soviet psychiatrists when we have Robert J. Lifton here who studied Nazi doctors and was concerned about
Soviet ones too. Yeah.
Yes, and Soviet ones too, and that was explicitly the concern that we stated, and we even stated our concern about the APA's modification of ethical guidelines under political pressure, apparently, and that colluding with the state, becoming an agent of the state, is exactly what Nazi and Soviet psychiatrists had done. But the APA's statement seemed to dampen the discourse, and I was later told that reporters often don't like to bring on experts whom their professional associations have denounced, because it becomes complicated. They have to bring on a different point of view, and so they let go of it altogether. Around that time, however, when I had a much more public face, I also received a lot of death threats, a lot of threatening messages and death threats, routinely about 1,000 a day. A lot of them were Twitter. And I didn't know at the time, I didn't know anything about bots and trolls. I was new to Twitter because I was told I could correct misconceptions over social media, and so I had no idea about all of this. I was bombarded with menacing messages and daily phone calls and emails, and so people had recommended I call the FBI. I just hid in my home for about a month. I actually feel for Dr. Christine Blasey Ford because she had to move her home, and nothing really came of any of the threats. But after a month, they died down, in some ways it was even a further letdown, because it meant that our voice didn't really matter anymore, and people weren't listening as much. It was actually fairly dramatic. With the APA statement, within 2 or 3 weeks, the media stopped contacting me, and then there was no more discussion of mental health. In fact, there was increasing discussion of dangerousness, and the public recognized. We were flooded with messages from the public onto our website, because by that time all these thousands of mental health professionals have formed the National Coalition. We called ourselves the National Coalition of Concerned Mental Health Experts, and we're ready for any kind of interviews or consultations. But all that we got were messages from the public, but they were saying, now the pundits and the news people are talking about dangerousness. They have picked up your language without giving you credit, of course. And then when John Bolton was appointed National Security Advisor, and the dangers were increasing, we were getting messages saying, you were right all along. How did you know? And so that kind of affirmed the fact that that we needed to do this book. By the way, this book was an instant New York Times bestseller. It within 2 days, all the major stocks were depleted. Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Macmillan, one of the big five in terms of publishers, had a hard time keeping up with the demand, that it took 5 weeks to finally get the stocks regularly filled. But it was so unexpected, and as it would be of a multi-authored, specialized knowledge book of this kind, even if as a trade book. So the hunger from the public was there, and the responsiveness from the public has been continuous. In fact, after the month, when the threats died down and I went back to my office, there was actually a mountain of packages and mail from the public, of gifts, of books, boxes of chocolate, pictures of their children, jokes, stories, thank you cards of the public that was really heartfelt, far more sincere than any of the threats could be. And that was really the voice of the public, I felt, and we were, in a sense, helping to buttress the voice of the public. So now to just give so a year since this has happened, of course, a lot of the dangers have borne out to be not just threats for speaking up, but white supremacy killings, hate crimes, the pipe bomber who sent 16 explosives to prominent Democrats and critics of the president, the greatest anti-Semitic attack in our history, where people were gunned down in a synagogue, and 17 different cases where legal arguments could directly implicate the president's rhetoric in terms of people having done violence to others in the public. And now it's precisely a year since I was interviewing with the media every day, and I had not earned an income for 12 consecutive months, trying to meet the demands and trying to be available for the public. Now I've made that up at least a little bit, and I took 2 hours for Christmas and 10 minutes for New Year's, because of the constant activity over Christmas, including the unexpected withdrawal of troops from Syria and the government shutdown, and that continues to this day. And still, the American Psychiatric Association has not transitioned to taking more of in my mind, a societally responsible stance, or even allowed us to. And so from the standpoint of our national coalition, we stepped up in terms of our activities. We have global partners now, and we renamed ourselves the World Mental Health Coalition. We are organizing an interdisciplinary conference where we're bringing together experts from different fields, including not just mental health, but law, history, political science, atomic science, trying to bring attention to this issue. So this conference will happen in March in Washington, D.C. And as we're speaking, and as we're doing this, the situation of our nation, of our world, of course, is still uncertain, and the dangers continue to grow. And we know from a mental health standpoint that the further he stays, not just the institutions are weakened, but also the psychological health of our society deteriorates, and as well as the geopolitical culture of collaboration and peace. And so this is the condition that we've been in. But if there's an upside to this, the camaraderie and collegial support that I've had among my colleagues, the support that we've had, the feeling that our belief in what we were doing, as well as personal support from many prominent psychiatrists around the country, and chairmen of departments, and even the chairman of my department, who came out and stated in his State of the Department address, calling it a heck of a year because of my activities and because of Yale having been implicated in all of this, actually endorsed my activities and gave his approval of it all. And so at least I know that my position in my department is not in danger. So that is where we are, and I thought I would give you this personal history rather than more of a theoretical argument for the Goldwater Rule versus duty to warn, or our societal responsibility, or Geneva Declaration, whatever I try to bring up to defend our actions. But I'm of course open to any kind of discussion.
One of my colleagues wrote me an email in which he said we shouldn't have to worry about Trump because he'll be restrained by the Republican Congress, the Republican Supreme Court, and the Republican FBI. So we know how that worked out. You described how immediately after the election, violence was feared. Was that only nukes or anything other than that?
Actually, they were mainly concerned about hate crimes because they were. These are lay people in organizations who are working with, mainly working to eliminate prison violence and solitary confinement, but they were also working with members of the public, and they knew that hate crime had already risen at that time, but they were correct because the Southern Poverty Law Center came up with an immediate spike in hate crimes the day after elections.
So we know that moral atmosphere starts from the top, and what we have basically is licensed for bigotry.
Yes, the authority that such a voice is given in such a position, and the influence, the cultural influence it has.
Thank you. On behalf of the public, not just the profession, and I'm surprised that there's still enough scotch and whiskey for all of you to continue. The question I have is, have there been over time now any people from the other side who've come to consult with you in any way, from the Republican side, who were much more intransigent, to try to learn more and to be open about this, or is that just a totally solid concrete wall?
Well, the way that we got one Republican senator's audience was, in fact, while delivering this book, there was a group, Heard on the Hill, in Washington, D.C. that was spearheading any kind of messages from the general public. So they got enough constituent letters supporting this book and asking their senators to read this book that we were able to deliver it to all senators, Republican and Democratic. And so we were gaining audience of their aides, essentially. And that was when the senator walked in, and we had a brief encounter to speak with the senator. The aides are generally very open and friendly, but they always are, I imagine, to constituents or representatives of constituents. And so they would openly, just non-judgmentally hear what we had to say and take notes and say that they would relay the message. When we actually met with the senator, the response was complete startle and freezing and a blank wall. Because if there were any endorsement or opposition that would be let known, then her political position could be compromised. So there was that kind of a barrier that I sensed. Very different.
I think Joyce is next, yeah.
Frequently, as we all know, when he doesn't like what somebody's writing or doing, he threatens a lawsuit. Did you ever hear any kind of?
Actually, no. I think because at the same time as I was getting attention because of the congressional members' meetings, Fire and Fury had come out. And that was probably occupying his attention, that this book wasn't much on his radar, especially something with less of an obvious, I guess to him at least, of what the book might be about. The day of release of this book, however, he did tweet. It was one of those rare tweets of a book that he made. Of a book of the opposite opinion. So he was getting some kind of message, and we know that people were tweeting him about this book, that this book was coming out, and so on the day of release, he tweeted about another book that was positive of him.
So, having read the book from beginning to end, I think it's superlative. I learned a lot. Of course, I've read all of Robert Lifton's book in Nazi Doctors and Thought Reform. And Yom Shinrikyo, Destroying the World to Save It, is very much an important book for our time. I guess I wanted to comment, when we chatted, you told me that some Trump supporters called you or communicated with you, and when you were able to dialogue with them. I'd like you to talk about that. And then I also just want to comment that I just did an interview with a former neo-Nazi organizer. He had his own band. He actually recruited the man who did the Tree of Life synagogue shooting, I believe. And so I said, tell me about, President Trump. And he said, totally, it was an A-OK, let's go for it. We finally have someone who's going to represent white people, etc. So validation from the ground floor, so to speak. And lastly, so two things I'd like you to talk about. The accusation that you're partisan. You started this concern, and you didn't. That wasn't. So if you can talk about this.
Well, first, the partisan accusation. I was never interested enough in domestic politics that I never bothered to register for a party, never participated in either party, and I only voted presidential election years, and so my record actually is dismal. As much as I have been concerned about policy, and so far I have testified in 5 different state governments on prison reform, but never have I gotten involved in partisan politics. Just for me, it seemed like a bickering between 2 very similar groups. Of course, it's not so much anymore. About 4 or 5 years ago, I actually did a study with James Gilligan on political party and suicide and homicide rates. And consistently, one party could be called the death party, and that suicide and homicide rates would double with the presidency, and the other party they would halve. it's only because of the for 111 years in our history, that's been consistently the case. The only reason why it's not apparent is because we alternate. So you can obviously guess which party is responsible for the greater deaths. The law and order party, the one that's tough on crime. So that was the one study that I did, and that alerted me to the difference of the parties. But and I hadn't spoken, and none of these other mental health professionals had spoken. It's in fact unprecedented in our country's history that so many mental health professionals have come forth about their concerns about the mental state of the president, regardless of party. So that's how I usually answer that question.
Could you just comment about Trump people who you would interact with?
Oh yes, so all these emails, all these Twitter messages I was getting, I was actually responding to them. If they were more than one-liner, and if they were not, I'm going to take you out before you take out Trump, kind of thing. I did respond to them, trying to engage them, and with about a half dozen or so, I've engaged pretty deeply, and I use my divinity school background. I have Master of Divinity, so that was one common language I could use. I also consider myself a patriot. I studied Enlightenment philosophy and all of that as an undergrad. So I would use my love for that, and would point to my thesis and theme of thesis to recruit some of those people. And what I've discovered is that Trump supporters are not all white supremacists, or but actually they were quite very innocent and well-meaning people who were misguided largely by institutions, by the church that's been evangelicals, especially, that have been co-opted by their political agenda, and the nationalism that many demagogues make use of. And so I never managed to really convert any of them from Trump, but I have some came very close, and at that point they could no longer have a conversation with me because my humanity and concern were obvious to them, and they couldn't make me into a monster.
And see, you've been waiting patiently here.
Oh, yeah, no, I had a couple of, I have one comment. It seems like it's what can be done about a situation like this. And two aspects of it. One is it seems like it's a cultural problem versus a legal problem. And one of the interesting things when I came to this country, and at one point we lived in a very rural area, and there were lots of people like Trump, which is this kind of Trumpian behavior and attitude. And one of the things in the school system I was shocked at, because was that they taught America's the greatest country in the world, Americans are free, no one else is free. And so when I heard Trump say he was going to make America great again, I knew he was going to win, because these people would vote for him, because the propaganda started in elementary school. But when you look at it from a legal perspective, there is no mechanism to deal with sort of a cultural malaise, a sort of values. In this country, I feel there's no value system anymore. And so the question is, how do you deal with a culture that has now sort of gerrymandered districts? They've been very clever in how they've taken control.
Yes. I think calling it a cultural issue is important. I mean, I take Ruth Benedict's assertion that culture is culture is personality writ large. So it's important to also distinguish between culture that is intrinsic in this land versus cultural disorder or heading toward disorder. I often say that violence rates are a great barometer for societal mental health, our collective state of mental health. And I've always been worried about our state of public mental health because of the conditions that are promoting violence, and in many ways, not just behavioral violence, but also structural violence. And structural violence being inequality and the widening gap between the rich and the poor, and lack of access to basic things. And so rural people, of course, are hit hard by it. And I don't really take their, I guess being a psychiatrist, I don't take their ideology as being intrinsic as much as the psychological need to espouse a kind of ideology. And so if we take care of that psychological need, give them identity, give them a place, belonging in society, then a lot of those problems will disappear. It's a problem.
I've always been against the Goldwater rule, and I was wondering what, because I think that it's part of the public discourse to have professionals who know something about personality disorders and violence to call it as they see it. And but I always think, you know, with the disclosure, it shouldn't be a problem. What is your opinion on that?
I actually have been keeping the Goldwater rule in my forensic practice because, you know, as you know, you're often asked to testify on minor public figures at times, and they sometimes ask for a conclusion or diagnosis without seeing the person, and I always
No, that's different.
obviously unfit president. But a study came out stating that with the diagnostic practices we have now, that a personal interview is not necessary for an accurate diagnosis. So based on
I
evidence,
agree. Yeah,
I
that's
would
what
actually,
I'm saying.
I would actually tend more in that direction now than I had been in the past.
Yeah.
First, I'd like to say thank you for talking. It's very nice to be able to listen to somebody who's spent a lot of time with violent men and personality. 13 years in prison. I'm very curious to see where you were coming from. One of the things that strikes me, and I think this is related to what Mitzi said, is it sounds like I was kind of expecting from what I heard and looking for more construct validity that I didn't see, or predictive validity, and because those are the only things that begin to take you out of the actuarial into something that's more predictable. Because the environment's so much of what draws people out. I found, I mean, when we were worried about violence in prison, we also knew the system. It was a closed system. And almost always, while the individual had something to do with it, it also had a lot to do with the conditions
Yes.
in the prison. And I'm hearing you talk about more of a public health
Yes.
thing, which is not the way for me. And I have to, you know, I know some of your contributors, some of them personally, so I didn't have time, so I haven't read the book, which I now actually think I'm going to do. Well, yeah, you'll know what that's like.
Is there a new edition coming out?
There's a new edition coming out in March if you wish to wait.
Are
till
these
then.
the same authors up?
Same
rating or
authors
changing?
are included and 10 more added.
Yeah.
So it's going to be a fatter book?
It's going to be a huge book.
Good, that's
Even
what
for
I
your
like.
staff
That's
after.
what I like.
Don't discourage, Tyler.
So,
We should say one word about your personal courage.
yes.
That you risked career suicide as you knew going in, and obviously that was an issue in an ongoing way until things seemed to turn, and your own chairman supported you. So I just want to point out the bravery you showed in an incredibly stressful environment, up to and including death threats.
Thank you. Well, as I said, I teach law students who represent asylum seekers, and these are, many of them are political asylees who have seen their family killed before them. They are imprisoned, gang raped, tortured before they come to this country. So I actually, while aware of how badly this could go, I also compared to what many of those clients have been through, it's nothing.
When we speak of this, il DCLU is, bringing suits regarding the children who've been separated and are still in the country, thousands, not being admitted to. Do you deal with the children and their, do you have any follow-up on these children who are apparently all over the country, without their parents at all? And the psychiatric effects on that, that's a particular interest, especially, I'm wondering if Judith Herman, with her experience in PTSD in young adults, whether you guys work with that stuff.
Judith Herman wrote an article on it, and we turned it into a letter to Congress members, and so we sent it to a number of Congress members. Many of the members of the coalition I spoke of are actively involved in this. Some have volunteered to go down to the border to offer therapy to families.
So, but is there a follow-up that your organization is involved in keeping any kind of follow-up on, find the children, what's going on?
Not so much in that practical a way. Dina Sinopoli, who wrote the letter that had thousands of mental health professional co-signatures, she's part of our group, and we tried to highlight it in ways that we could.
Is there a way we can, we feel so helpless in this kind of time because we see things moving in the predictable direction
Yes.
that we all knew was going. Is there anything we can do that you can recommend? We live in Massachusetts, fortunately, where things are a little more sane. But
Yes.
anything you would recommend for us to, how can we help in this effort? Because I truly fear a civil war on
Yes.
our doorstep.
Well, we've been doing a number of initiatives, writing letters to Congress members, and having the coalition is helpful because we can get hundreds of signatures all at once. And we even issued one during Brett Kavanaugh's hearing process because it came out of President's impaired decisional capacity and so on. So. If any of you are interested, you can get on the mailing list of the coalition. It's called dangerouscase.org by this title. We're looking to change it, but for now it's that. If in the future we have such letters, all your names will be incredibly influential.
Is there a listserv, a discussion?
Yes.
What's the listserv called?
You get on it through the website, dangerouscase.org.
All right.